But today, I'm the greatest of all time. Thank you.
Never stop, I'll get it if I want it. Gotta make to myself a promise. I won't quit, keep going till I got it. I won't give up till I'm on top.
Yo, no, I ain't the type to give up. If I do something, man, I do it till I get what I want. I turn a business out of nothing into something I love. I got a poker face, but honestly, I'm not one to bluff. I flip a switch, never miss, man, I always stay up. Don't let them see you, always have a plan to stay tough. This life ahead of you ain't easy, it was built to be rough. But that's what makes a personality, is tragedy, bruh. So keep your head on your shoulders. Now we ain't out here moving rocks, we out here moving boulders. Now we ain't getting posterized, we out here making posters. And we ain't got nothing to hide, we move forward like soldiers. You better wake up for the pay stub, or you'll pay up. Don't make love to the game, bruh, fuck the game up. Change up, rearrange stuff to your greatness. Same us for the way up, play the game, bruh.
Never stop, I'll get it if I want it. Gotta make to myself a promise. I won't quit, keep going till I got it. I won't give up till I'm on top, yeah.
You know I'm always honest, there ain't no way I'll never stop it.
I won't quit, keep going till I got it. I won't give up till I'm on top,
I'm always flirting with pain, she like to hurt me and maim. I'm always working to change, but she's still lurking the same. I keep on building a dynasty while the haters be trying me, but they hate from inside.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Unscripted here on the Elite Sports and Entertainment Network. We're talking head coaches today. We're talking head coaches with Jay McLovin, and it might not just be the NFL. We might throw some NBA coaches in there as well because there has been a couple NBA coach changes in the past week. But Jay, thanks for making some time today and hopping on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I just think, with all the stuff that's going on around the NBA and the NFL in terms of coaching changes and some of the things that we thought could possibly happen, and, of course, some of the things that kind of threw a left hook in there, it's good to talk about it, man. It's good to be hanging out with you.
Yeah, so as you know, the NFL has that special day that they call Black Monday. I mean, it's special for some people and obviously not special for other people because Black Monday is typically the day where a lot of head coaches get fired. It kind of triggers a little domino effect where head coaches, GMs, and that kind of get fired within that first week of the offseason. And we saw quite a bit of head coach firings this year. I believe it was 6 or 7 job openings, if I remember correctly, that fired their coaches after the end of the season. Some of them I think everybody thought were a surprise. Some of them were not surprises. And then some of them were just kind of, you could see why they did it. At the same time, maybe they shouldn't have done it. But the first one that I want to start with is the Raiders job, mainly because Josh McDaniels was the first coach fired this season, and it happened 7 weeks into the season, which I've always been one that said that Josh McDaniels is a hell of an offensive coordinator. He's just one of those guys that isn't cut out to be a head coach in the NFL, and I think he's proven that time and again that he's just not head coach material, and that's nothing against him because he's a hell of a play caller. But you had Antonio Pierce come in and kind of do exactly what Rick Bisaccia did when John Gruden got fired, where he took over kind of a team that was in turmoil, built him up, and I mean, he didn't get him to the playoffs, but he had him playing at a very high level come the end of the season. The entire roster backed him. A lot of the people in the organization backed him. And I think the Raiders made the right choice by not letting him go. I think they made the wrong decision in the first place by letting Bisaccia go when they did. So I think this was a good do-over, and I'm very happy that Antonio Pierce was given the recognition that he deserved to get that job.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about this before the show came on, and and I was telling you, and I think actually, I think you may have told me, and then I was just commenting back on you how many minority coaches have been hired versus the last few times we've gone through these coaching carousels. And Dustin, like I know, man, back in the day, it wasn't that long, but a year, 2 years ago, that the NFL was an upheaval over this subject matter.
Yep.
To a point where I thought we may not have a season because it was getting pretty out of hand. And they're talking about all kinds of craziness. So it's good to see that minorities are getting hired. Antonio Pierce, he's familiar with the Raiders organization. The players like him. He's got the buy-in of the locker room. Hopefully he can bring back some stability to this team. Clearly they have some off-season needs to redress, to really get this Raiders team back, in contention, and serious contention anyway, right? So Garoppolo clearly is not the answer. I don't think really anybody over there is the answer. So they're going to have to look forward to the draft. So, one of the things I like about this for Antonio, Dustin, and I know we talked about this, is that it gives him the chance to move up in the draft, like we talked about, possibly maybe try to get that number 1 seed and really put his stamp at the field general level and really make this his product that he's going to give Raider Nation.
And the thing that not a lot of people talk about is, yes, the Raiders finished 8-9, and that's not a great record, but under Antonio Pierce, I believe they were 6-3 or 6-4. But what people don't realize, in the 10 games where he was the head coach, they had the number 1 defense in the NFL in terms of points allowed, and they were only allowing 14.8 points per game over the 10 games that he was the head coach. Yeah. Offensively, they were inconsistent, but defensively, they were outstanding. And obviously, having a guy like Max Crosby helps you there, but I'm not saying they can play at that level all season, because if they were able to do that for a 17-game schedule, you'd be in the conversations of the greatest defense of all time for like a regular season side of things. But if their defense can play anywhere close to the way that they played those 10 games this year, any consistency on offense is going to make that a 10 or 11 win team next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think that they're going to have to think hard, if they do decide to try to get that number 1 spot away from Chicago and trade for it. What exactly are they willing to give up? I get the draft picks, because draft picks are possibles. Possibly they turn out, possibly they don't turn out for, the number 1 spot and get the field general that you really covet. And this draft class is extremely deep at the quarterback position. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So I guess the point is, and Dustin, you've seen Max Crosby's name thrown in the trade scenario. I got to be honest with you. I don't think I give up Max. I give up the draft picks, but I don't think I'm giving up Max.
See, I don't think they give up Max either. I can see Josh Jacobs as a possibility, knowing that they franchise tagged him last year. They have that option to franchise tag him again this year, and if that's the case, I could see him being possibly a trade piece. I could see Hunter Renfrow possibly being a trade piece, because you still have Devontae Adams. You have Jacoby Myers, who had a great year this year in Oakland. Or Vegas, not Oakland. You have Max Mayer, the tight end, who had a good year. So I could see Hunter Renfrow being a possible trade piece. And like you said, obviously draft picks are going to be the ultimate thing. And that to me, depending on what you can give the Bears or whoever they trade with draft capital wise, I think it'll go. But I think if they really want to trade for that number 1 piece, you're going to have to put a guy like Josh Jacobs or Hunter Renfrow.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking more like you are. I don't know about Hunter Renfrow. I don't know if he's high enough. I definitely think Josh Jacobs is. Yeah. And I think with the emergence of what we've seen from Zamir White when Josh Jacobs was injured is enough to say, okay, we can let Josh go, bring in Zamir, and really, groom him up. And it's not going to affect us like, a Mason Crosby would affect us if we lost him. We can recover from Josh just because we have Zamir, right? And again, if you get that field jump, that's the most important damn spot on the team. Mm-hmm. I mean, without him, you have nothing, even if you have a great defense. So I really like this for Antonio. I really think, Raider Nation should get behind him in terms of the brass on the upper levels and say, hey, look, let's give this guy the quarterback of his choosing. Let's get that number 1 spot. Let's let him choose his guy, and then let's go from there, right?
And then another team that actually fired their coach, it was kind of one of the last, I think it was the last coach firing of all the coaches that got fired. And to me, it was a very surprising fire, and that was the Tennessee Titans letting Mike Vrabel go. Vrabel was in Tennessee for 7 seasons, and his first 5 years with the Titans, all he did was either win division titles or make the playoffs, and he was a very good coach his first 5 years. The last 2 years, he's been 8-9. He was 8-9 in 2022, and then he went, I think, 5-12 this year. So this year was not a good year, but you kind of look at the injuries that he had to deal with this year, not having Ryan Tannehill for a chunk of the season, not having Malik Willis, having to go with Will Levis and taking the bumps and bruises with him and Derrick Henry and all that kind of stuff. I thought Mike Vrabel would be around for one more year just because he did have to go through a lot this year just to even try to be competitive. But in a league where a lot of these young offensive-minded assistants are starting to get jobs and starting to kind of change the way the NFL is played, I'm not surprised that they did let Vrabel go. And I'm not surprised that Brian Callahan is stepping in to take over for him, the former offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals the past 5 years. He's also the son of longtime NFL coach Bill Callahan, who's one of the more respected offensive line coaches in the NFL. But you look at a guy like Brian Callahan, he was a offensive assistant for a few years with the Denver Broncos. He was a quarterback coach for the Lions under Matthew Stafford, for the Raiders under Derek Carr. And then he went to the Cincinnati Bengals the last 5 years and has been the offensive coordinator for one of the better offenses. It's going to be interesting to see how he does here in Tennessee, because his future right now, I think, hinges on Derrick Henry and if Derrick Henry is going to be back or not. And if Derrick Henry's not going to be back, Tennessee offense isn't anywhere near the Cincinnati offense in terms of how they play. So it'll be very interesting to see who he brings in as his assistants on both sides of the football and what kind of offense he wants to play.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things, you know, one of the things I don't, and correct me if I'm wrong. Has Kafka been hired by Seattle yet? I know his name was thrown around.
Mike Kafka?
Yeah.
I don't.
Or is the Seattle job still open?
Yeah, Seattle and Washington are the only two jobs still open.
Are the only two jobs still open? Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Okay. Yeah, you know, outside of the Raiders job, I know that the job you were talking about just now was Washington, correct?
Tennessee.
Or Tennessee, excuse me, Mike Vrabel. Yeah, that's where I was going. That's where my mind went left. I was thinking, and that's where I wanted to tie that in. I apologize. My mind tends to wander sometimes, Dustin. You know, Vrabel was let go, and you know, a list was put out by one of my friends that lives up in Seattle. He's a big Seattle guy, and he does some podcasting about the Seahawks. And you know, you had a laundry list of names on this list, right? But they were all substandard coaches, right? No real big names on there, right? Just mediocre. And I noticed that Vrabel's name was not on there. Kafka's name is on there, believe it or not. But Vrabel's name is not. And I'm wondering why Seattle has not chosen to want to interview Vrabel. Like, you know, because to me, Kafka, if that's the guy you were thinking about putting on your list and things like that, you'd be better off just keeping Pete Carroll as your coach, number one.
Yep.
And then number two, why would you not have Vrabel on that list?
Because I think if you look at the league nowadays, most of these teams are hiring offensive-minded head coaches. You look at the AFC right now. John Harbaugh, offensive-minded head coach. Andy Reid, offensive-minded head coach. Kyle Shanahan, yeah, we know his reputation. And then Dan Campbell, offensive-minded head coaches. So a lot of these coaches are getting away, or a lot of these teams are starting to get away from the defensive-minded coaches, which Mike Vrabel is. And they're trying to bring in these young, offensively gifted play callers like you've seen the Sean McVay tree, the Kyle Shanahan tree, Kevin O'Connell, like a lot of these offensively minded gifted play callers. So Brian Callahan is kind of falling into that category just because of what he's been able to do at Cincinnati.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, so that's another thing. And I'm really surprised that Bobby Slowick's name's not on the list.
We'll get to him in a little bit.
Right, but I'm just saying for Seattle, why is his name not on that list? You know, I mean, there's so many players or so many coordinators. Like Mike McDonald's name's not on that list.
Yep.
And you know, and if you looked at this list, it was just below grade. Now, I would say the best coach on there that they had was Dan Quinn, and I'm not even a big Dan Quinn guy. I like the regular season Dan Quinn as a coordinator. Not too excited about the coordinator Dan Quinn. But that was the highest name on this list that was the most reputable. The rest of them were just a bunch of, you know, scrub guys, in my opinion, that they were looking at, you know?
Yes, and then another team that let a coach go, which I think a lot of us expected it, but at the same time, we didn't expect it, and that is the New England Patriots deciding to move on from Bill Belichick after 23 years in the organization, but coming off of the worst season he's had as a professional head coach.
Right.
I look at it, can you blame him for the team's struggles this year? He never had a quarterback, really. He never had the roster that he once had. And in my opinion, he was kind of put in a position to fail this season as opposed to be put in a position to succeed. I thought ultimately they would take away his GM duties from him and leave him the coach one more year and see what were to happen if they drafted a guy like Jaden Daniels or Drake May to give him like a legitimate starting quarterback just to see what he could do with it. But by getting rid of him, they're appointing a first-time head coach in Gerard Mayo from the linebacker coach to the head coach in New England. And no disrespect to Gerard Mayo because he's one of the more well-respected assistants in the game. He's one of the more well-respected linebacker coaches in the game. But for Gerard Mayo to be successful, he needs to bring in a hell of an offensive coordinator. He needs to bring in a hell of a defensive coordinator. And I'm going to say it right now. I do think Josh McDaniels is going to end back up in New England as that play caller because for as much as he's struggled as a head coach, he does a great job as a play caller in New England.
Well, yeah, and I think that was clearly evident with the rookie season of Mac Jones. Playoffs, rookie season. And then he goes and becomes a head coach with the Raiders, and then Mac Jones just looks like crap. Like literally goes from looking like the greatest thing ever, to just complete and total dog crap. To the point where we're putting Zappy in, we're putting him in, we're putting Zappy in, we're putting him in, and no consistency was ever formed. And and I tell you, going back to Bill Belichick and him, him getting, Bill Belichick was his own worst enemy. Look, you're the GM. So you are absolutely, that team is everything it is that you made it. Everything is your coordinators, everything. The fact that you wanted to bring in Matt Patricia and Judge and think that you can make those guys an offensive coordinator somehow combined was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. And you saw what the fruition was. And then you bring in Bill O'Brien, which, wasn't a bad move, but obviously it wasn't enough to do anything with what you had. So everything that's going on with Bill Belichick literally is a direct result of Bill Belichick just being his own worst enemy. He should have, just been a coach, let the GM bring in the right personnel, things of that nature, right?
And I think the easiest coach of all the ones that got fired, I think it was the easiest decision to make was Brandon Staley getting the axe in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You just look at the talent that Chargers roster has. Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Austin Eckler, Mike Williams. Granted, he did get hurt in week 2 this year. And even on defense, Nick Bosa and some of these pieces they have on defense. There is no excuse why this Chargers team is always sitting around 500. And then for this year, for example, at 5-12. There's no excuses for it. And the only thing that you can point to is Brandon Staley and the decisions he makes. He cost the team 5 games last year by not punting and not kicking field goals. He does the same thing this year by going for it on 4th down and just inexplicable situations and basically costing his team not necessarily games, but giving up points that if you punted it away, you may have not given up. So to see him just get fired, I thought he would be fired even before he got fired, but I think this was the more of all the people that were on the hot seat. I think he was the most obvious that was going to go. And then you look at who they brought in, Jim Harbaugh. Absolute slam dunk pick. Every place this guy's gone, whether it's been the University of San Diego, Stanford, Michigan, or San Francisco, all he's done is win games. And he finally has a quarterback in Justin Herbert that he's going to be able to do something special with. And as long as they keep these pieces together in the Chargers organization, I think the Chargers can make a Super Bowl within the first 2 or 3 years of Jim Harbaugh, knowing his reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. The one lifeline I would give Staley, or I guess slight excuse I would give Staley, is they have had a lot of injuries. There. I mean, Justin Herbert had fingers broken, taped up, casts put on, out there still throwing the ball. And then you had Keenan Allen, which is just a walking injury. I mean, you breathe on the guy wrong, he goes down. And Mike Williams has been out for injury too. And then Eckler's been out with injury and so forth. Bosa's had his injuries on the defensive side. So I do want to give a little bit of soft credit to Brandon Staley in terms of those injuries were a plague on that team. Yeah. However, to Dustin's point, as much as the injuries were a plague, so was the play calling and the decision making. And those are the things that you cannot overlook, right? You can kind of overlook some of the injuries and say, look, the guy just unfortunately had the injuries, but you cannot overlook the play calling. And to Dustin's credit, I think that's the reason why Staley had to go. It's just because of the decisions that he made, the play calls that he made. It was time. And look, you can't turn down a Harbaugh. No, like Dustin said, this guy is a winner. He's been away everywhere he goes. He's still extremely young. He's not completely old, so he's still relevant to the game of football. And in his hard-nosedness, what he brings, on the desires and the way he can connect with the younger talent group, because that's what you do in college. You connect with all these younger kids. If you can connect with them at the college level, you're certainly going to connect them at the early pro level. So, yeah, I absolutely look forward to him leading this group. Now, 2 to 3 years for a Super Bowl? Yeah, it's likely. I think that, but again, the biggest thing that Harbaugh is going to have to deal with is the injuries, Dustin. Mm-hmm. Can he keep this team healthy enough to do what he wants them to do?
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. Yeah. And then you go over to like the NFC South, where half of that division needed new head coaches this year, which they were the worst division in football, with Tampa Bay winning that division at 9-8. So you knew that one coaching change was going to happen. And then you kind of had a sense that a second coaching change was going to happen based on just the overall consistency of Arthur Smith, but it was not very good consistency because he was 7-10 every single season. So that's not a good consistency, but at least I can give him credit for being consistent. And all the talk you heard was Bill Belichick going to the Falcons, Bill Belichick going to the Falcons. And the more you heard, the more you listened to it, the more you thought he was going to go there. He was going there for a second interview. I think everyone expected to go there. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Raheem Morris is now the head coach in Atlanta. And again, kind of like Gerard Mayo and some of these other assistants, Morris has been a longtime defensive coordinator, one of the better defensive coordinators in the game. He's one of the more well-respected coaches in the game. But he's had a shot as a head coach before, and he was not very good when he had his first go-around with Tampa Bay. And now you're going into a situation where your quarterbacks are Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. Neither one of them appears to be a long-term answer. I'm kind of worried in terms of how long Raheem Morris is going to last at this point, because he was not in a good situation in Tampa Bay when he first got the head coaching gig and proved that it was tough for him to coach. He's going into a similar situation in Atlanta where he's faced with a tough gig. So I don't know. I don't know how long Morris makes it here before they're going to start questioning that hire.
Yeah, I didn't say it about Gerard Mayo, but I didn't like that hire for the Patriots, only because of the fact that, it's hard to go from a positional coach straight to a head coach and skip the whole assistant coach prospect, because I think that's where you get your experience. That's where you really start to learn learn the decision-making process. But yet they put you straight to the head coaching spot. To me, that's almost a setup for failure on their part. So it wouldn't surprise me, honestly, if Gerard Mayo fails before Raheem Morris fails, because unlike Gerard Mayo, Raheem Morris has gotten a Super Bowl at the coordinator position, so he understands what it takes to be a Super Bowl champion, number one. Number two, he has a great defense, and he can build this Atlanta team into a really good defense. And I also think one of the things I like for for Raheem Morris, is he doesn't have a quarterback. He's got two backups, but he doesn't have a QB1. And this is his opportunity. If he can convince Arthur Blank, again, just like Antonio Pierce over the Raiders, Raheem Morris is in the same position, right? They both need to leverage up as high as they can get to get their QB1 in the future. And I think this is where Raheem Morris can put his stamp on this team, is through the draft. And hopefully he get the QB1, which is a deep class, to lead the way. Maybe he gets a Michael Penix. Maybe, in the later picks. Maybe he can get a Drake May or somebody of that nature, in the later picks. If he can't get as high as, 1 through 4. I don't know where Atlanta's drafting currently, though.
They're drafting 8.
Yeah, so they're drafting 8. So if they could switch up to like number 6 or number 5, they are in great position to get a really good quarterback for the future. And I think, and look, Raheem Morris, you got to believe he's not dumb. You got to believe he's telling Arthur Blank, hey, look, this is where I see your team. This is my plan to get you back in fruition. This is what I need from you and to do in the draft to get me what I need to contend with. There's got to be things in place where he's going into this situation to feel comfortable. I mean, he's been around the league long enough that he knows those kinds of things. That's just me. If I was going through an interview, because you're interviewing them like they're interviewing, you. So I'm like, hey, look, this is what I need. The status of your team. This is why your team is where it is. This is what I can offer, but this is what I need from you in terms of the draft and things like that, right? So I think he'll be okay. I would much rather be in that situation than be in Canales' situation over with the Panthers or even in Antonio Pierce's with the Raiders, because I don't like that Raidership group for anything. So I think he's in a better spot personally.
Yeah, and now that you brought him up, let's get right over to Carolina. Frank, the whole Frank Reich hire with Carolina was a great hire in my opinion, because Frank Reich is a good head. I wouldn't say he's a great head coach. I'd say he's a good head coach when he's given the right personnel. And right from the start, you knew this relationship was already going to be on hot water because Frank Reich did not want Bryce Young. He made it perfectly clear that he wanted C.J. Stroud. He wanted to draft C.J. Stroud, and Dave Tippert and that ownership group basically overruled him and said, no, we're taking Bryce Young number one. So Frank Reich didn't really have a choice in that, and you kind of saw how that panned out. Bryce Young was terrible this year, flat out terrible this year. Carolina started 1-8 or they were 1-10 before they fired Frank Reich and ultimately finished 2-15 for the number one pick again. And for a guy not even to make it 12 weeks into the first year of a 5-year deal, that I'm not going to blame him at all for it, because he never wanted the quarterback he was given. He was put in a tough spot. Ownership expected more from him than what he got, but at the same time, what was he supposed to do when he was trying to tell you that Bryce Young wasn't the answer for his system? And now you replace him with a guy in Dave Canales who zero head coaching experience. Sure, he was the offensive play caller for Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay and actually had Baker Mayfield playing pretty well. But Baker Mayfield has 7 years of starting experience in this league, not 1 year of starting experience like Bryce Young. So you have to wonder how that's going to translate right away. And I've said before, the best option for Carolina at this point was to make Jim Caldwell a short-term head coach for about 2 or 3 years, have him mold Bryce Young up a little bit before committing to somebody in the future. But now, if Dave Canales has similar results to what Frank Reich had last year with Bryce Young, what position is Carolina going to be in at that point?
That's a very good point. And that's what I'm wondering, because, you knew he wanted Stroud. Everybody knew Frank Reich wanted Stroud. And I think this was, I don't think they're going to the Super Bowl with Stroud because, they didn't have the receiving core and a lot of other things that Houston Texans have, right? But I do think in my heart of hearts that they win a lot more games with C.J. Stroud in his first year than I think Bryce Young did.
I think they win probably 6 games, which it's not great, but 6 games is better than 2.
Oh, yeah, well, absolutely. And here's the thing with short quarterbacks. Only a handful of them have ever really made, at it. And I think Drew Brees was probably one of the best when you're under 6 foot that was able to do it.
And Russell Wilson.
And, okay, well, yeah. I mean, I'll put Russell in there because he has a Super Bowl. But I'm just saying, Drew Brees, that when he first came in with San Diego, he was going through a lot out there. And I really think the only thing that saved Drew Brees' career was that trade that got him over to Sean Payton in New Orleans. Yep. And Sean Payton knew how to develop him and get him where he was. And I said one thing I feel bad about Bryce Young. I think Bryce Young needs to get out of Carolina as fast as humanly possible, unless they can bring somebody in to really develop him like Sean Payton did for Brees. Because I don't think they did a good job at all in developing Bryce Young for that season.
And then there are 2 jobs that remain open at this point, one being Seattle and one being Washington. We'll touch on Seattle first here. It was kind of the same situation with Mike Vrabel, where Pete Carroll actually had a winning season. He finished 9-8 this year, and they only missed the playoffs because they didn't have those tiebreakers over the Rams and the Packers, who also finished 9-8. So it's not like Pete Carroll had a terrible season. Granted, he hasn't had the years that it used to have the last couple of years. So that could have weighed into the decision. But you kind of look at what he's done with Geno Smith the last 2 years and kind of how he's turned his career around. Like, I don't understand why you part ways with a guy that helped get Geno Smith to the level he's at right now. And now you're looking at Dan Quinn. Looks like he's the favorite in Seattle right now because I think he is the only coach that's been granted that second interview, and I think that's coming tomorrow. So Dan Quinn is the favorite right now in Seattle. You just fired a defensive-minded head guy in Pete Carroll. You're possibly about to hire another defensive-minded guy in Dan Quinn. But apart from that one season where Atlanta got to the Super Bowl, and that I think was more so Kyle Shanahan as opposed to Dan Quinn, Pete Carroll to me would be a better option than Dan Quinn. So I don't understand the Seahawks thinking in this one.
Yeah, absolutely. They took Pete Carroll out of his coaching spot, threw him up in the front office, only to put a list together that looks like, the Golden Corral buffet, and I don't understand that. I don't understand how any one of the guys that are on their list currently are better than what they had under Pete Carroll. And that's the part about Seattle, and I think Seattle in general, fans out there in general are upset about it, is the fact that they're not bringing anybody in of great value. They're certainly not bringing in a Slovic, the offensive coordinator down there in Houston. They're not bringing in Mike McDonald from the Ravens. They're not bringing in, anybody that has, worth the damn, innovative skill set, right, that can lead this team. And that's one of the things that really makes me, wonder. I mean, they're not even looking at who's the offensive coordinator over there in Detroit with Goff?
See, that's the thing, though. They can't look at him right now.
Well, no, but I'm saying like I would wait until after the playoffs.
Yeah,
and
you're talking Ben Johnson.
Thank you, Ben Johnson. And I'm surprised they haven't looked at him, as a possibility. And again, what you just said, you'd have to wait till after the Super Bowl. But I would much rather wait until after the Super Bowl to talk to these guys rather than bring in a slew of hand-me-downs, if you will.
And that leaves us with our last team in the Washington Commanders, who kind of very similar to Brandon Staley. I think Ron Rivera was on his last leg when the season started, and the longer the season went, I think it was clear that the team didn't have his back anymore. I think it was clear that he was on the way out, and they just weren't going to fire him because they fired the defensive coordinator. They fired a lot of the coaches on defense, so I think it was more of, we fired everybody else on this staff. We're just going to kind of hang Ron Rivera out to dry at this point and let him finish off and start fresh. And this is the most interesting team to me at this point because of the new ownership group and because they have a guy on their staff in Eric Bieniemy who he's been trying to get an interview. He's been trying to get a head coaching job for the last 4 or 5 years. For whatever reason, everybody says the same thing over and over again, that the main reason why this guy does not get a head coaching interview is because he does not interview very well in the interview process. And if that's the case, I kind of want to know what interview process they're talking about, because, I mean, what kind of questions are you asking him that he's failing? But if he doesn't get this Washington job this year, I don't know when he will get a coaching job, if he ever does. But at the same time, I think Washington really wants Bobby Slowick in Houston. But from all accounts, I haven't even heard his name brought up in an interview at this point. I haven't even seen an interview. But I think the one guy they're ultimately going to hire is Ben Johnson. I think that's kind of why every team, for the most part, has interviewed a head coach, at least a handful of head coach candidates. Right. As far as I can remember, I have not heard one name linked to Washington yet that is even interviewed. And I'm wondering if that's because Washington already made up their mind who they want to hire. They just got to wait until the Lions are done in the playoffs to go after a guy like Ben Johnson. I think it's going to be Ben Johnson in Washington. I wouldn't be upset if I was a Washington Commanders fan. I wouldn't be upset if that's what they're really wanting to do, is wait for Ben Johnson. I certainly would bring Bobby Slowick in for an interview
just so when I interview Ben Johnson, I have something to compare it with, in terms of that style of thinking, because both Ben Johnson and Slowick have developed really, really good, strong offenses with their prospective clubs, and they both have brought great offenses to clubs that didn't really have a good offense there for a while. So, either one of those two guys would be great candidates, and I'm certainly going to interview both of those guys before I'd make a decision for Washington. The thing about Bieniemy, from what I've heard, is that when he interviews, he thinks more like a coordinator than he does the head coach. And I think that's kind of what's done him in, is the fact that he can't get out of the coordinator mentality and into the head coaching mentality. And I think that's kind of what has hurt him a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, if Washington was to get a Ben Johnson or a Bobby Slowick, I mean, that would be great. Either one of those guys, I think, would do a really good job over there for Washington. And if you kept Eric Bieniemy as your coordinator, which I think he's a great offensive coordinator, that would just be – and he's got a ton of expertise, right? So you're coming in – like, let's say you get a Slowick. You're coming in as a first-year – or a guy with maybe not as much experience. Yeah. And then you got a coordinator who has Super Bowl, experience. That really does help your transition, right?
Yeah. And then before we get out of here, there are 2 NBA coaching jobs that, well, one has been filled, but one just opened and hasn't been filled yet. We'll start with that one first. The Washington Wizards have removed Wes Unseld Jr. from his coaching role and have moved him into the front office, which I think that's more of, we're going to fire you, but we're not going to fire you. So you either kind of step down on your own and take on a different role, or we're going to fire you. And I think it was kind of like, okay, I'll go here. And they just kind of made a position for him. I don't even know who you can really put in this position right now. I think obviously they're going to roll with one of his assistants as the interim head coach for the rest of the season, but then you got to head into next offseason and kind of focus on who could be available to even take over that job. The name Mike Budenholzer comes to mind for me. You saw what Mike Budenholzer did with the Atlanta Falcons or Atlanta Hawks when he was there. He took over an Atlanta team that won 19 games the year before he got there, and within 2.5 seasons, they were a consistent playoff contender in the Eastern Conference and even made a couple Eastern Conference finals. So Mike Budenholzer, to me, would be the top option if I was Washington to go after a guy in the offseason.
Yeah, when you got a guy like Giannis who really, I think was upset when Budenholzer was let go, I really don't think Milwaukee is interesting to me, man. They're.
Oh, we're getting there next. Don't worry.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll leave Milwaukee alone for right now. But yeah, no, I'll stay on. Let me stay on track here. Yeah, Budenholzer is definitely the way I would go as well. I think he's going to give you stability. He's going to give you experience. He knows what it takes to win a championship. And I think hopefully he'll help you drafting, help you in your draft process and evaluations. So yeah, man, I think, they need somebody to give that team stability. That team hasn't had a stable coach or a stable, regime in a while. And I think Budenholzer would definitely do that for them.
And what people don't realize about Budenholzer, because, nobody really remembers his Atlanta Hawk days. They remember what he's done with Milwaukee, and rightfully so. But Mike Budenholzer has the 4th best winning percentage all time in the regular season.
Right.
Even when he was in Atlanta, the guy knew how to win games. Granted, he hasn't had as much playoff success as you would like, but the guy knows how to win games. And for a team like Washington, that they had a nice little 3-4 year run with Scott Brooks as their head coach, where they were making the playoffs every single year. But now they've made the playoffs just once in the last 5 seasons, and now it's going to be once in the last 6 seasons. Right. They could use a guy that can consistently win in the regular season and make the playoffs. And obviously the ultimate goal would be to win a championship. But if he's at least getting them to the playoffs, that's 90% of the battle. Then it would just be coming how to finish it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And it's going to be interesting to see where Washington does go from here. You got to imagine Budenholzer is going to come in for an interview, right?
Yeah.
I can't imagine him not coming in for an interview.
And like you mentioned, the Milwaukee Bucks, which for a team that just won the NBA championship a couple years ago, they seem to be in so much disarray right now. Even though it might not show, I think a lot of it has to do with behind closed doors and the things that we don't see.
Right.
They seem like they're in so much disarray right now. They fired Mike Budenholzer, which we just talked about being one of the best regular season head coaches of all time. Not really a great playoff coach, but he still had the Bucks in 3 Eastern Conference Finals, or 2 of them maybe, and won a championship with the Bucks. So obviously he had playoff success with the Bucks. So you fire him because they failed to win the championship last year. You bring in a guy in Adrian Griffin, who he's a very well-respected assistant head coach. He's had one crack as a head coach before, and I believe he went either 32-50 or 30-52 in his only year as a head coach with the Raptors. So not really a great first impression, but back then the Raptors were not what they were now, so you can't really hold that against them. And yes, he was off to a great 30-13 start this year, but apparently something wasn't going well behind closed doors because they fired him 43 games into a 5-year contract, and now they got to pay both Budenholzer and Adrian Griffin for the next 4 years, which goes well. And the new replacement is Doc Rivers, and no disrespect to Doc Rivers, kind of in the same boat as Mike Budenholzer. He's one of the best regular season coaches of all time. But what is Doc Rivers going to be known for? He is going to be known for blowing the most 3-1 leads in the playoffs.
Oh, absolutely.
So you're going to fire a guy who was basically a 500 coach in the playoffs in Budenholzer and replace him with a guy who's actually under 500 in the playoffs in Doc Rivers. I just don't understand the whole concept and thought process behind it.
Yeah, no, I totally 100% agree with you. And I kind of still wonder if Milwaukee has buyer remorse for bringing in Griffin and letting Budenholzer go to a certain extent, right? But you're right, man. You let go of Budenholzer, only bring in Doc Rivers ultimately, right? And you could have had a better – it makes no sense. But then again, and of course, I like Giannis. Giannis comes out and says, well, I'm going to trust the Milwaukee Brass that they are going to make the right decisions. I'm not going to worry about the team because I know Milwaukee Brass is going to handle everything. And this is a team that gave you an under 500 playoff coach. And that's what you want to trust. Okay, hey, go out there, big boy. It's your career. I don't understand it. I'll never understand it. The way that they make their decisions, honestly.
All right, that's all the time Jay and I have for you today. Enjoy some of the rest of our shows that we have on the network. I know we have a couple shows that are going to be kind of popping up over the weekend, and we'll have some shows going on next week. So until then, thanks for hopping on to another episode of Unscripted.